Thanks for tuning in to Minds of Tomorrow. I'm your host, Luis Acevedo, and with me today I have a special guest, James Tunney. He is a lawyer. He has lectured across the world from France, Germany, and China on law, on international law specifically. He's also a prolific writer. He has numerous books out, and he's also a prolific painter. I'm very excited to have this conversation with you, James, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you very much, Luis. I appreciate the opportunity, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. I've seen some of your interviews before, so I really appreciate the opportunity to have a conversation and to dig a bit deeper into some of the topics we're going to talk about.
Of course. So, James, I think it's important that you give some context about your background, where you're coming from, before we jump into the topics of discussion today, which are scientism and scientocracy, technocracy, and spirituality. And, if you can give a little bit of your background.
I'm from Ireland. I studied law for 7 years and 3 degrees. I qualified as a barrister, and then I decided that I wanted to concentrate in further studies on areas of mainly international commercial law, which is more important in many senses than international law, which merely deals with states. But I saw that the global legal order was changing to be more driven by commercial forces. So it was international commercial law in particular that I focused on, and in particular dynamic areas. So I taught as a lecturer, senior lecturer, a visiting professor, and concentrated on that. And that gave me a very good insight into the structure of the world, and in particular, the emerging of governance systems around the world. And these were difficult things to keep abreast of, even if one was involved in it, because things happen so quick, and it was very, very difficult to see why they were happening so and where the force of change was coming from. So being in the center of those things in the European community, having relations with China, I began to see different forces and how they emerged. And it's very, very difficult to get a sense of that if one is purely engaged in a local, national observation. So globalization, those issues were important to me: intellectual property, competition law, communications technology. Those were subjects that I taught before they were big subjects as they are now. And after teaching for about 15 years, I said that I have to concentrate on other issues which are more important to me. So I left all the contacts voluntarily. I left the academic world, and I concentrated on my family. But from a personal context, I concentrated on painting and writing. They were the two things. And in that process, I began to experience, shall we say, more mystical depth in my life and more experiences which clarified my thinking on a number of issues. And so that was a very personal journey. But in that personal journey, and in the sense of inspiration and interpreting the world, I began to come back to these bigger issues, because it became clear to me that the evolution of the global system is a system which is going to attack the person. And all mysticism comes from a celebration of the person, firstly, from personhood, and the spirit and the spiritual element of life. And it became clear to me in, let's call it inspiration in an artistic sense, that these issues about technology were the pressing issues. There was no other big issues. The regulation of the individual by global converging forces and the individual's role was the big issue of our time and of the future. And so therefore, although I didn't want to, I thought it was necessary for me to come back and to re-engage in public discourse. I had no desire to. I was quite happy not being before the public, quite happy painting and writing, but I think it was necessary for me to come in with my twopence halfpenny words to say what I thought. So I wrote, for example, a novel, a difficult novel, for example, Blue Lives September, a few years ago, and I self-published that, which was about lockdowns in London and the rise of draconian legislation over what I had as a natural catastrophe, kind of dystopian novel. But for me, that was coming. So my intuitive sense corresponded with my analysis that I had gained in a very rational, reasonable sense from looking at the evolution of law, and they corresponded. And if I could intuit that, for example, London would be in lockdown, etc., etc. Now, people say, "Oh, well, we didn't know this was going to happen," but that's to some extent is true. But the forces were going in that direction, and that worries me. So my concern when the first set of interviews I did with Jeff Mishlove on New Thinking Aloud, and I did them in January 2020, and I said clearly that in an interview on globalization that we're moving into the end game, and my concern was about scientocracy. And I was there wasn't anyone talking about that fear then, because just as I was coming home, my wife said on the alternative media, they're talking about this COVID stuff, etc. So it wasn't in the public eye at that sense. It was a very strong intuition I had. Now, I could have come from that from a rational perspective, but I came from it from an intuitive perspective, and that concern hasn't gone away. I believe that we've crossed the threshold, that subsequently we have moved into, and now there's different terms one could choose. I've taken the word scientocracy. It involves, as you know, technocracy. It could be described in context of technocracy. But there's other ideas. The idea of the technosphere, for example, or the technium, which refers to the totality of all the technology in the environment. Or if we look at Jacques Ellul, the Technological Society, he talked about technology and technique. So we're talking about the sum total. So in my view, what we have is a contest, an emerging contest. Well, it's not it's emergent, but it's here between the growing technosphere and the biosphere, which we are part of. And I would, a term that I think I've coined, I haven't come across anywhere else, is the animosphere. The animosphere I use to describe the totality of the imaginal world. So the technosphere is growing, and the objective of that is to assimilate us. This is the inherent force of the growth of technology. This was realized by people like Jacques Ellul and Bernard Charbonneau and other people. For example, Gunther Anders, the great critic of techno-authoritarianism, who wrote in particular, who wrote in the 50s when he realized about the power of television. They understood that there's something about the nature of technology that allows totalitarianism. And there's many people share that view. There's nothing new about that view. But what they haven't been looking at sometimes is the way these systems of power are converging, the way politics, the way law, technology, commerce are converging into systems of governance. And it's very, very clear now that the nation state, we've moved beyond it. So some of the debates that people are engaging in, they're battles that have been lost 20 years ago, 30 years ago. People are only beginning to understand that. So as they say, generals in the military often prepare to fight the last battle. It's the same situation. Intellectuals are fighting battles which have been lost. For me, what we're focused on is a battle by the technosphere against the animosphere, the biosphere. And in that, we have an assault on the idea of personhood. It primarily comes from science and scientism, and that has been taken by the process of deconstruction, but they often come after science has set the agenda. And in particular, if I was to focus on one element, one thought process behind the technosphere, is the idea of, going back to John Locke, of ratiocination, that Blake was dead against, that he saw that this idea of measurement, of control of nature, control of the environment, was a deadly force. and the tree of science is death, or as he said. And this force is manifested in the movement towards transhumanism, for example, the idea that humans are machines, that machines are better than humans, that intelligence is what machines do in calculation and ratiocination, and that the biology must be replaced by mechanical forces or means. And we see this in particular in the work of the great crystallographer. I say great as a crystallographer, I don't like his views beyond that. John Desmond Bernal in the 20s, in his book, The World, the Flesh and the Devil, where he specifically lays out the next 100 years by, in particular, the idea that we'd substitute biology with machines, that would initiate an area of space travel to escape the Earth, presumably because scientists have destroyed it, and that individuals who didn't go along would live in the human zoo. And now this is a frightening picture that has been laid out. I don't think it's inherent in science to some extent. It reflects in a way a kind of magical stream, a Nietzschean stream of control, of not regarding the individual, the person, as significant, of focusing on one element of the human, and in doing so, disregarding all the other elements, disregarding in particular the unquantifiable, disregarding qualia, qualities, those arguments that we're familiar with, and because they can't be easily measured. And in disregarding them, they disregard consciousness itself. As we know, many scientists say, well, you have to prove now that you're a person, or that you have selfhood, or consciousness doesn't exist. It's a frightening deconstruction. That deconstruction is not accidental. It's not a debate. It's designed or calculated with a purpose to remove human opposition to this insane movement towards technological control, towards the creation of a godlike figure in the technosphere, where the technology merges with intelligence and the individuals become hooked in as in a network, as nodes in a network. They become reduced to elements in that, and the humanity is disregarded. So the only solution to that for me is to recognize what all spiritual traditions have said, what perennial philosophy has said across the board, whether it be in Islam or Judaism or Catholicism or in the Orthodox approach, that we're spiritual beings, and we are representations of the divine consciousness. And spiritual evolution involves us moving towards and accepting or expanding the domain of our divine consciousness, moving towards the angelic, which was the basis of humanism. We go back to Mirandolo, for example, and that's where the conflict is. Sorry if I went on too long. You have to stop.
No, it's great. I love hearing you just go on, because you have a lot of valuable things to say, and you bring in a lot of just a lot of information that's very important. And I think that what you're describing is hard to accept for the majority of people, that, because we have this now demonization of a conspiracy theory, and effectively essentially what you're describing is this big conspiracy to sort of take over the control of the world, and then put humanity, or just like belittle humanity, and then essentially create a new God, is what you were alluding to. And I think that has a lot to do with this whole AI movement. But don't you think that even though there's this huge attempt to destroy humanity, as you're saying, that there's going to be this opposite reaction where people are going to go within themselves, and then you're going to see this sort of revival of spirituality?
2 points there. Firstly, in relation to conspiracy, conspiracies exist, and we know that the state accepts that they exist because it has legislation against conspiracies, and people are often prosecuted, especially if they don't have a good case. They'll be prosecuted for, say, conspiracy to murder, for example. A lot of famous cases have been done on that basis. But conspiracies exist in legislation, particularly in the context of antitrust. So, and conspiracy also really means, as we know, to breathe together, coming together. Conspiracy in law is a very low basis. For example, if we want to fix prices, we don't have to come down and have a price fixing agreement. We can go out on the golf course and I can say, how is the price of pipes and your whatever, and we can begin to indicate in subtle ways. So conspiracy doesn't have to be in a smoky back room, so, with deliberation. Although in the space, in the transnational spaces, we know that there is this apparatus. I've been following people for years, looking at where they go. My family are involved in politics in Ireland. I didn't get involved in it, but I was in that milieu. So you pay attention to particular figures. And I can see certain figures, not just talking in the Irish context, and who participate in various international meetings that are not part of a structure, and they do well. So that's all over the world. So the same people are meeting behind closed doors. There's no doubt about that. If you want to look at all the different places, you don't have to get into Bohemian Grove or any of those places, or Sun Valley or Bilderberger. They meet regularly and they discuss things. Even in the internet, for example, the people who behind the internet meet to discuss issues about the internet. So these things happen, and in legal terms, that would come in the definition of conspiracy. I do a little bit of martial arts now and then, not in any really serious way, but in certain cases, when, for example, grappling and you're on the ground and you're in a bad position and it can only get worse. And then when you're in a position where you can't do, say, for example, someone is choking you and the grip is in, you see the people observing know that there's virtually nothing you can do at a particular stage. My concern is that the straitjacket is getting so tight that the room to maneuver is so small that it will be very difficult to resist. Now, I'm in no way a pessimist about the future, but by the same token, I have heard a lot of, I'm not talking about you in this context, I've heard a lot of people who believe that everything is just going to be nice. And there is a propaganda element as well towards moving towards, in the end game, to lull us into a sense of peace, that everything is going to be okay. It won't be okay if we don't engage in that spiritual journey. And what is critical is that individuals engage with their full personhood and their own spirituality in whatever way. Now, it's difficult for a lot of people to accept that they even have a spirit. It doesn't speak to everyone, or a soul, or it's younger people that have been subject to this propaganda machine find it difficult, some younger people, to talk in those terms, because there has been so much propaganda from the machine. And again, we can look to Chomsky and his ideas of the propaganda model to understand that everything we see in the matrix, which comes from the mainstream sources, are governed by the forces which govern it. So they're not independent in that sense, as we know. So the requirements now are that we have some kind of mass movement, which is non-violent, but that requires a deep level of engagement from people who understand and accept that the most important thing in this agenda is the human person, for me, the individual person. But that's not, a lot of people don't accept that now. With the movement to transhumanism and post-humanism, there's a lot of objection. And there's been an attempt to obfuscate and obscure humanity by bringing the animal situation into it. I'm all in favor of a greater respect for animals, for treating animals, for doing away with or for looking at the industrial mechanization of the animal world and the meat world, etc. But a lot of that is a product of science. The meat plant is the classic metaphor of deconstruction, of taking things down to the bottom. So I've no problem with that, but a lot of posthumanism, for example, is predicated on the idea that we have to devalue humanity in order to revalue animals. So there's some kind of quid pro quo, but I think to a certain extent, whether intentionally or not, people behind that movement can be lulled into serving the purposes of the scientocracy, if we want to call it that. So yes, that's the only way that can happen, but it may happen when there's the last group of spiritual humankind in the cave somewhere. I mean, it really, I'm not very, very hopeful about that mass movement yet. I don't see enough signs of it. If it's to work, it has to work by people being able to supersede and come out of their narrow categories, to elevate themselves to a higher level, and also to engage in disciplined discussion respectfully with others, to find solutions to counterbalance the costs of the technosphere, to work to look for the benefits that can be gained, to work within systems to balance it. But at the moment, we're in that situation where we're in a chokehold, and you may have 6 or 10 seconds before you pass out. When we pass out, we won't be in any position. And there is a feeling for me that the people have been hypnotized largely for in my generation. I can see a transition from the time growing up in Ireland. You can see a process whereby people more and more are assimilated into the matrix, if you can, of constructed views, less and less independent. So it's an uphill struggle. So yes, but it's not going to happen automatically. In the end, there will be the death of the spirit of the human race. The human race is under threat. A lot of people and sensible critics say that we're in the last generation or two of the human race as we know it, because if it's transformed, it becomes something else. A lot of proponents believe that it's going to evolve in some way by calling artificial intervention an evolution, which is not. And the idea of Homo sapiens, it will not be able to subsist or to survive. And in that sense, it may be that there will be Homo spiritualis that comes out of it. It may be that it is necessary for the people who have sat on the fence to commit themselves to spiritual evolution in a way which is kind of non-sectarian, which is looking to the higher perennial wisdom, which seeks to accommodate different belief systems, and which seeks to do so in an intelligent way where it's informed by the things in the world. So it doesn't run off and hide in a cave somewhere, but it's able to engage. So if that happens, yes. But I'm not as optimistic. I'm not optimistic yet that there's sufficient awareness of that danger. And of course, there's not going to be if people don't accept this true. But they will see more and more, and I predict that they're going to see more and more robots around in the next couple of years. And at a certain stage, people will begin to see that they are less valuable than the robots. And this may register a bit, but at that stage, they're in a position of bondage and slavery. So,
right, and I do have to say that I'm in complete agreement with you as far as the human goes. That we're very important, and I think that the human gets left behind in these new way of thinking. And I think that's sad, but I think it has a lot to do with the fact that people in my generation and younger generations, like millennials and Gen Zs, the religions of our time have failed, I would say, to sort of adapt their messages to suit, what's going on. Like we were talking beforehand, you look at a fundamentalist institution, and mainly you have older people there. It's hard to attract new people that way. And then the new people, it seems to me, the younger people rather, are gravitating towards the idea of scientism, which we were talking about. And we see these slogans everywhere: trust the science. And even though it's not real science. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I agree with you absolutely that if there ever was a time for religious institutions to play their part, it would have been now. And the Catholic Church, for example, which I was brought up in, has failed miserably. In fact, there's a great argument to suggest that the church structure is very, very comfortable with the evolution of global governance. Remember, this was always the agenda of the Catholic Church: Catholic, universal, global, universal jurisdiction. It is, in fact, the real precursor of the idea of global governance, true law, true principle based in Rome, etc. So you might argue that they're very, very easy and with this evolution of global governance. I don't really put it down to age, because I think, in fact, we have to, consistent with the indigenous communities, look to the elders, look to people that have experience. But you will find often that people that have been critical, are older, they will be alienated. Their voices put out to pasture. So they have failed, and there is a link indeed between this authority, this failed authority on one side, and this new authority. So we can see it today. I saw something about Zuckerberg and religion and new systems in that context. I've long predicted, for anyone that listens, that we're going to have a new universal religion. There will be a religion. Now, we could say that that is science or scientism, a version of it, or some kind of techno-religion which blends the two together and is able to create a simulacrum which reflects the ideas and brings in ideas of transcendence, particularly through pharmaceutical means, which is why I believe the industrialization of psychedelics is part of the picture of this mass system. And going back to Timothy Leary and the Good Friday experiments, they know how to create feelings of transcendence through pharmaceutical means. So it's very, very easy to see that we have some vague notions, values, which are perpetuated in a context where the old ideas, which are anti-religious, are translated into new religion. So in many senses, I agree with the German theologian Rahner, who said that if Christianity is to survive, it will only survive as a mystical force, or the next brand of Christianity will be mystical Christianity. And I believe in that. So what I believe is that it comes down to the individual, that the individual has to experience some sense of the interior life, of the mystical journey, of that expansion. It has to be experiential, but I don't think it should be experiential run by commercial forces. So I'm skeptical about a lot of that. Yes, they have failed miserably, the people that should have been able to contribute towards and to oppose this technocracy. There are voices and there are forces in the religion that do talk about these issues, but they're not going to fit into a propaganda model. And in this, the stream which has spoken to me most recently is this idea of personalism, which there's a number of different locations or representatives of that idea. William Stern, who was the father of Gunther Anders. Anders changed his name, he was Gunther Stern. So William Stern came up with his version of the idea in about 1900 and wrote a book, Person and the Thing, 1906, where he distinguished between the person and the thing. And this is a distinction that's more and more important, because they want to transform people into things. Right. And that informed Gunther Anders, it informed Hannah Arendt. Martin Luther King was informed by personalism. So there are good models that we can look to, and they emphasize the significance of the person. That doesn't mean you disregard the environment, because all of these ideas of personalism also gave rise to phenomenology and the idea that you respect experience and respect how people exist in the world. So therefore, we would have to respect how the individual reacts to the environment or interacts with the environment, for example, as possible. I think there are certain philosophical trends that we will look to more and more. But again, the individual has to become really engaged. They can't outsource their spiritual evolution or control of their lives to some other big force, and certainly not a new monolithic scientocracy to replace the existing religious institutions.
Right. And just to play devil's advocate, when you mentioned the psychedelics and potentially giving a synthetic version of what transcendence is or enlightenment. There's also virtual reality worlds, whatever, that you can meditate in, and these have helped people out significantly. And I actually there's this book, I think it's called Children of the New World, and it's just a compilation of short stories. And in one of the short stories, they talk exactly about what you were saying, the transcendental experiences that you can experience from these psychedelics and how they were helping people. So do you see any benefit whatsoever into these, psychedelics and these new technologies to sort of provide a synthetic or an artificial version of what one can already do naturally? Do you see any benefit in that whatsoever?
I don't have a particular problem with them. I have a particular problem with the claims about what they are. So I've no problem, and I'm quite believe in not interfering with people's exploration. So if people want to do that, I've no problem if they do it with informed consent. I think in relation to psychedelics, I think it really belongs in particular in the indigenous tradition. So where it happens in an indigenous tradition with that experience and traditional environmental knowledge, I'm a lot more open to it. Not personally, because I don't really feel I need that. And people say, well, that's arrogant. But then, for example, if I took psychedelics and I had mystical experiences subsequently, it would be difficult for me to identify whether they were related to the prior psychedelic experimentation. And I know that people can have, you hear about the good side, but also a lot of people have bad experiences. So I've talked to people that had bad experiences and they have their flashbacks and they had a horrible experience, etc. That's part of the agenda as well. My problem is where it is a deliberate policy of industrialized control, where they utilize the pharmaceuticals, knowing that this can pacify. And this is the argument or the suggestion of Aldous Huxley, that people would begin to love their servitude. So my concern is that it's being pushed very, very strongly for that purpose. And in the context you mentioned, we'd have to refer to the 1999 essay by Terence McKenna about psychedelics in the information age, where it's very, very interesting. Now, a lot of people love Terence McKenna. I find it very, very interesting, but I dislike the implications and the emphasis he took in relation to focusing on prosthesis. And that essay is very, very important. So for him, virtual reality, psychedelics was a prosthesis in the way that transhumanists talk about, something that's added to make the human evolve. And he believed that that was necessary to break boundaries. So boundary breaking was important. And this is a fundamental concept too in a lot of transhumanism and posthumanism. So the problem is that you have to ask yourself, is this a deliberate policy to begin to depersonalize, to facilitate the integration of the individual into the technosphere? And my belief is that it is. That once you say, well, Luis, it's only an illusion that you are a person. It's only an illusion that you have consciousness. Boundaries are bad. Let's have your little implant here. Take it like a good boy. This is the kind of implication of the bad actors. Oliver Wendell Holmes is the Supreme Court judge who said that when you're studying law, you have to, or legal principle, you have to look at it from the perspective of the bad man, of what the bad man is going to do with these things. So I don't think it's liberating when McKenna is advocating the deliberate, as a policy, boundary breaking, that they use these to where they can be taken by a controlling force to implement this boundary breaking so they can penetrate our consciousness. Now, this is the model of a lot of technology. You get your mobile phone, I don't have one, but you get your mobile phone and they say, here's a great liberating tool that you have. And then you find after a while that you're told to stay at home because you get a message on your mobile phone with this contact tracing and that. You see that it was really a method of surveillance. Again, in relation to the internet, there's great advantages, but the initial promise, again, has subject to an inherent movement of technique to control us. So that's an inherent flaw. So I've no problem with people on their individual journey. They should follow their own path, and they should be informed by the best advice. I don't think it's a good idea personally for young people. I don't want to sound like an old, going out experimenting with as a first port of call. I do understand. There's no doubt about it that they can unlock a door for people, that they can create an opening. The problem is that opening has to be sustained. If it's sustained by pharmaceuticals, it will amount to nothing. If it opens the door to people to be able to evolve spiritually, that's a different issue, to begin to see the dimensions in their own mind that they didn't understand. And there is another interesting issue that I've seen, that people that are very into computation, rationality, scientific mindset, very mechanistic, they have great difficulty in coming out of it. So it may be that their only way out of that labyrinth is through some of these things, some of these devices. So I don't have any problem with that. But if it's an instrument of control, I do have problems with it. And I think that, for example, McKenna, the way he talked in relation to prosthesis, virtual reality, pharmaceuticals, he saw was prosthesis, which is true. You could put other things, for example, that are ignored in this. The contraceptive pill has had more impact on society than a lot of other. That's a prosthesis in a way that operates by interfering with natural processes in the body to make something not happen. So there are interesting ways of looking at it. I'm not saying anything about the contraceptive pill, but what I'm saying is we do have to bear in mind that we're subject to these forces. I've no problem people doing it individually, but what these processes do, they can also be just fit into the consumer society, that here you can buy your mystical experience, stay at home in lockdown, and make it easier to stay at home during the next lockdown. Here's a whole load you can buy online from Amazon, happy days, and live in your little lotus eating context. That's what in the Odyssey and the lotus eating section was about. It can be very, very easy to fit into that avoiding, that escapism, and have those experiences. But mystical experiences were always a prelude to something else, and they're always related. You can't get away, unfortunately, from some idea of dogma. Now, the dogma for me is simple. It's something like love your neighbor, if you like. It's something about compassion. It's something about a fundamental recognition that you are a person, you are consciousness and embodied. You are that consciousness, the Atman, the Brahman of the great consciousness. And by recognizing that in myself, I have to recognize it in you, that you are the same thing. And once I recognize that, I have to treat you in a particular way. I can't denigrate you. I can't dehumanize you. I can't depersonalize you. You have to make an effort to rise above the other elements of our nature, to find the better angels of our nature in that sense. Mm-hmm. So if you talk about prosthesis and virtual reality, without some commitment towards a perennial philosophy goal of compassion or something else, it can become something else. It can become escapism, become a new version of America's Got Talent or something to entertain people. And if it becomes that, it's devalued. But there's no question that for some people, this can be a door, but I wouldn't recommend it to people if they haven't engaged in exploration of what is there already through ordinary means. It's very, very easy to enter an altered state. Spinning is one of the classic ways. Most shaman didn't take drugs. They went into some spinning context, darkness, easy breathing techniques, sound. There are many ways to enter into an altered state. So engaging in something that can actually change the physical composition of your brain is a bit of a gamble when you have all these other techniques. So hope that answered the question.
Yes, of course. So it seems to me that the biggest concern here isn't so much the technology in play, but who is in control of the technology. And I tend to agree with that. And it reminds me of the Brave New World. You brought up, Huxley, in where the people were pacified via Soma, and nobody had you couldn't have your own personal relationship with anybody. If you had a one relationship that was frowned upon, everybody was supposed to share everybody, which to me seems to be in line with this concept of the ego death. I think that this is, I think this has a lot to do with this movement of scientism to give up the self, which you've been saying, to give up the person and give yourself to something greater. Uh, because like ego, most people aren't aware that ego actually means I am. And this concept of ego death seems to be this new age concept seems to be in line with the plan to just give everybody to give up themselves to the state.
Yes, and here in many senses, if we look at the Enlightenment, for example, the Enlightenment has been engaged since the Enlightenment. They've engaged in a process of taking spiritual concepts and putting them into a scientific thing. So the concept of the Enlightenment itself is a spiritual concept. Illuminat is a spiritual concept. They do it all the time. They appropriate spiritual terms and repackage it. Now, for me, in the mystical journey, it's very, very clear that the first phase in all the traditions in looking at a perennial philosophy is that you have to engage in some transcendence of an internal construct which is limiting. So if you begin to become attached to an idea of yourself which is embedded in the material world too much internally, then you find it difficult to have that identification with higher consciousness. So if you operate under the illusion that you are atomized, that you are independent of the rest of the world, that you are separate, that you are totally sovereign, well, that's a problem. So the ego death, or perhaps, I think that's really where the domain of transcendence is, when in many senses, the first and major transcendence is to become aware that not that you don't exist as a person, but that your consciousness is part of the divine consciousness and is a reflection. So as, if you like, it's a pool which has water, but there is a great ocean. It's made of the same substance. It's in a different form, but it's still, or holographically for some people, it's the same stuff. So the concept that you're referring to in the ego death is more a reference to a stage in the mystical journey, but it doesn't depersonalize or dehumanize the person. And some people, in the context of referring to idealism and in the philosophical school, say, oh well, we should forget who we are, that forget that you have a name, forget that. Now that's a mistake in my view. That's a mistake to take that too far, because that's not what the implication of, because the reaction of a lot of the critics of technology like Ellul and Charbonneau, who came from Calvinist or Catholic and Marxist background as well, when they were advocating personalism, they emphasized the idea of incarnation, to accept the idea of incarnation, that we're here in the flesh now. And you see this in other trends in personalism. Martin Luther King said that he did a talk about accepting yourself, or how the individual man or woman could live in this very complex world now. And he emphasized the need to accept yourself, who you are, how you look, what your appearance, whatever. It's a very strong idea in personalism that you have to become comfortable with yourself. And then we can add in the other ones that came, the idea of self-actualization, which is related again to another personalist stream, to Goldstein, and a lot of thinkers that came from Germany, some of them came to the United States. So now, when we put it in a technological context, the idea is totally different. The idea is, we are going to take your personality, we are going to take your personhood, we are going to take your selfhood, we are going to take what is your dignity. We're going to disregard it. We're going to wipe the blackboard clean. We're going to say no personhood, no selfhood. You're not an agent. And in the theory of Donald Hoffman, for example, about conscious agents. So that if you look at that, he said, I couldn't make out where I stood on him until I read the book, and there was one sentence in the book where he said that consciousness is fundamental, but human consciousness is neither fundamental nor distinctive. Now, that's the key distinction. So what that scheme is in conscious agents is to say that if something can compute and do things and act in some way intelligently, we can ascribe consciousness to it in a kind of mathematical way. But humans thereafter are only one of these conscious agents. So robots can be conscious agents, but they will be more valuable because they'll be more conscious, presumably, if they can compute. So that's totally different from the spiritual tradition, which says, and it's very, very clear, and I believe it to be true, that each of us has within them consciousness, which is the greatest force in the universe. Now, if people realize that, and that's in the Advaita Vedanta tradition, that idea of looking and beginning to understand yourself as that, it's a very deep, simple, real proposition. You begin to understand that you are this consciousness. And then out of that, you realize that you have the potential. And out of that, you have the creativity. And your job then is to actualize that, as Maslow talked about in his hierarchy of needs, when he noticed that people that had mystical experiences were usually the most accomplished. They had moved beyond other needs. They were able to satisfy them and go to self-actualization. And again, that self-actualization idea goes back to a personalist, a person who advocated that idea of focusing on the human person. So I agree with you. They're two different things. So you have to be careful not to give away your personhood, not to allow yourself to be reduced to a number. This is happening all the time, all the commercial systems. I noticed that a few years ago when they started this self-service, that you go into a shop one day and they're saying, hello, how are you? Next day, they're herding you like cattle to work for them and not paying you. I found it very offensive. I mean, because I do find it, because it's a technique which reduces you. And even Yuval Noah Harari wrote an essay in 2018 in The Atlantic where he said that we were increasingly going to be treated like domestic cattle. And this is nearly 100 years later, well, 90 years later, saying what Bernal said was going to happen about the human zoo. So we have to be very, very careful. My argument in all this, if you want to interpret transhumanism, you have to look back and see where it was 100 years ago, where it came from. And these techniques will reduce us to domestic animals at best before we're disappeared, because we're seen to be difficult for the planet. And associated, to finish off on this point, sorry, associated with that is an idea of misanthropy, a hatred of humans, which is very, very deep. And it seems to go sometimes with people who love machines. And maybe it's because machines are easier to deal with. They're easier to control. It satisfies a control mechanism. They're not going to disappoint you in the same way that a human might do. They're not as messy. So there is something in the mindset which is creating a world in its own image, which is, again, part of the godlike thing.
Right. And it seems that, as you were saying at the last part of your statement regarding machines, that some people prefer to deal with machines, and then we have this concept of transhumanism, and then people think that we're machines. But as you said, machines are a lot easier to deal with. People tend to think, I think, deify computers and smartphones, when in reality, they're not really that smart. There's just a lot of computational power, and then you need a piece of code to link instructions together to tell it what to do. So you still need the human to tell that machine what to do, which then makes the human more superior than the machine. But now we're trying to merge the two for a lot of reasons. But where I wanted to take this now is I do believe that there's this false dichotomy between spirituality and science. Growing up, I was fortunate enough to have family that would say science and religion shouldn't be at odds with each other. I appreciate that because it helped me tremendously throughout my own personal journey, understanding that they're not really at odds with each other. However, what we see today is, this, as I said, this false dichotomy. But yet you see in science, they're taking ideas from spirituality, whether it be reincarnation or resurrection, with this idea of uploading the mind. But then in the spiritual sense, they're like, this is already taking place. This is already the cycle of life. Also, lost my train of thought there. So if you want to take over from there.
Yeah, okay. Yes, I agree with you that if we talk about science properly so-called, remembering that there's not one science, but there's many sciences, then the good scientists that do the things that they claim to do, look at method and apply, etc., shouldn't really have any conflict with a domain which purports to do something else. So as long as science stays within a reasonable domain for which it is effective and can demonstrate that it's effective, it works. Scientism for me refers to the context where it goes beyond the boundaries, beyond the domains of methods, and it transforms into an ideology, a totalitarian ideology, the belief that this is the only and exclusive way of examining the world and that all others are nonsense. And it fails to deal with the interior world, the internal world. And it may be because some of these people really don't have any interior world of that nature, that their mind is constructed, or spirit, whatever, in a particular way, that they find it very, very difficult to relate to other things. They believe that we're deluded if we have mystical experiences. In science, I'm a member of the Galileo Commission, or a professional affiliate of the Galileo Commission, and also the Scientific and Medical Network. The reason why I joined them is because I wanted to see what scientists are saying, because I talk about science, but if I don't know what science is, or I don't have contact with them, I can't really pass comment on them authoritatively. But they're defined by what they term as post-materialist science. So there would be a group of scientists who are a lot more open to viewing the world differently. And there are the Nobel Prize winners, and there are people I wouldn't have had contact with, or who have done Zoom talks, so you get the opportunity to ask questions of, which has been very, very useful for me. For example, Federico Fagin, who was very important in developing silicon chip technology, and he was critical in developing Intel's chips and that. So he's not some new ager, and that he's been at the heart of the development of the modern computer world. So, but he moved into consciousness later after having a personal mystical experience. So when he talks about the quantum soul and things, it's a lot more open than someone else. So, and he talks about conscious agency as well, but he talks about it in a way which is different to Donald Hoffman. So you begin to see the subtleties. So there's no inherent conflict between science and spirituality. And as we know, well, it's more than that. If we look back at Newton, for example, he was described by John Maynard Keynes as the last of the magicians. So they're also open to magic, which is another tradition within religion and spirituality as well. And a lot of the great scientists came from a religious background. And if we look at the study of light in particular, I wrote a book called The Mystery of the Trapped Light. And if we look at the theories of light in the 12th, 13th century, a lot of the great scientific work was done by people in the religious orders. Now, this has been taken out of the history of science. They don't want to acknowledge that these people were engaged in a study of the meaning of life. And in particular, if we take that issue of light, most great science in some shape or form is associated with the study of the spectrum, of light in all its different manifestations, which is also very closely connected with, say, theosophy and ideas of rays, etc. You can see it in very subtle ways. For example, one of the early people or families in Silicon Valley was the Varian brothers, and Russell Varian, who was important in the development of radar technology. He was called Russell because his father was a theosophist who would come from Dublin, and he was associated. He named him in honor of the Irish mystic A.E. Russell. And it's not difficult to see the connection between a philosophy or spirituality or system that's interested in rays, and then the people that, like in California, who began to study and look for physical rays. There is a correspondence between them. And some of the parapsychologists, scientists, they looked at both. They looked at the spiritual world, but they were interested in how the eye works, how light works, and they made contributions. So there's no difficulty. I would reconcile them by saying that the most fundamental path in science and the most fundamental path in spiritual evolution is the same. They're both about the study of light. And if you look at all the traditions, light is crucial. The problem is that we have a very limited idea of what light is. But many scientists, and in the quantum domain as well, they're looking at what light is and the nature of light, and they don't understand everything about and the connection with consciousness. So there are a lot more parallels than differences. It is in the middle where we have this, where we know that science can be utilized as a system by ideologues, sometimes that understand it, sometimes that don't, to utilize it to gain power, which fits in with the idea of managerialism, of the idea of a cadre of experts and expert knowledge that grew up in the last few decades that seek to control us. And science has the air of authority. It can be utilized to control us in that sense. But fundamentally, there is no proper science, and proper spirituality are not inconsistent.
Right. Right. And I would add to that too, that, if you look at the Bible, the Magi, the wise men, they were scientists of their day, if you will. They studied the stars, and that comes from the Zoroastrian tradition. And then also you have the Catholics back in the day. They contributed tremendously to math and science, as well as, if I'm not mistaken, Islam as well. There was a lot of so a lot of Abrahamic influences in mathematics and things of that kind too. Now, a lot of mysticism and a lot of religions have this concept of like a cycle, that there's this of the universe. Like in Hinduism, there's this death and rebirth of the universe. This is true in other philosophical thinkings as well. The first one that comes to my mind is Nietzsche with the eternal reoccurrence. So with that, how do you see, what is your take on that as far as where we are currently in our time in this cycle? Do you believe that there's a cycle where it's just we're sort of doomed to repeat this again? I mean, you have these stories in religious text, like Jesus refers to himself as the beginning and the end, which is sort of, implying that there's this cycle here. And you also just see this in other stories as well. So you have any thoughts on that?
I do, yeah. To finish off on the last point as well, of course, Swedenborg was another great example of a scientist who became a great mystic as well, and could bridge, and it was very, very influential in that context. Yeah, I do have a view about that. We go back to Vico, and Vico's theory of circularity was very, very important, very, very important for literature. Finnegan's Wake, for example, that Terence Mckenna liked a lot. That was based on Vico's theory of circularity, and you can see it in a lot of Joyce's work. For example, River Run past Adam and Eve's is the start of Finnegan's Wake, and that sentence links into the last sentence when the River Liffey is coming back into, when the fresh water is in Dublin is coming into the sea, so it's dying, but it's going to come back again in a cycle. So it's all about that cyclical nature. So I don't have any problem with the idea of cycles or in Taoism as well. You can see the cycles. But I do have a fundamental difference with a lot of eschatology, or a lot of John Darby Nelson was an Irish Protestant thinker who had a very big influence on American Protestantism in relation to the idea of what was the cycles and what was going to happen, and the apocalypse. And this has been very, very influential on evangelical, or certain streams of evangelical thinking in America. I've great problems with a lot of that eschatology and interpretation from the Book of Revelations. Now, I think that they refer to different things. And Swedenborg in particular said that the Bible wasn't, you don't interpret it literally. And that was his biggest issue. And if you look back in Judaism, they say that the darkest interpretation of sacred script is the literal interpretation. And this is a connection that Norbert Wiener, the father of cybernetics, wrote about in God and Golem Inc., where he said that there's a curious connection between gadget worshippers, which he was afraid of. He began to realize that science and cybernetics could be very, very dangerous. And he pointed a finger at gadget worshippers. And the quality that he identified was literalism. And this literalism is the bane of, it's the difficulty in religious, in fundamentalism as well, where people can only focus on the literal meaning. And this is, again, a mindset. It's a mindset of the people sometimes that are symbolic logicians, that are drawn to a very narrow, literal, mathematical view of the world, juxtaposed against a more mythic, poetic view of the world, the ability to draw different contexts, to interpret in different levels, to be open to different levels. Any esotericist knows that you can't read the Bible in one way. You can read the Bible and find different things. You can read Genesis in different ways, about the human body, about the chakra system. You could read it as a way to interpret what is happening, certainly, but it's on a different level. When you get literalistic about these things, they don't work, in my view. And then, especially for Christians, when you talk about what's going to happen, you should look at what Jesus said, surely, and not something which is in some part of the Bible elsewhere. That's the thing that I've never understood. I've never understood that. Now, Jung saw himself in some ways as continuing along the work of Jesus Christ in the sense of individuation. That's where he saw it as being. And he thought that the Christians made a mistake by focusing on the suffering on the cross as opposed to the symbol of resurrection. So my view is that there is a great danger in the Hindu system, in the Christian system, whether Catholic, Protestant, whatever, where they become deterministic on the basis of a literal interpretation of something. That's not the way I view it. Part of the consciousness that we have is genuine free will. I believe that we have free will. I can understand the arguments, and there are silly experiments which purport to very bad science, in my view, which enough scientists have not criticized, which purport to break down and attack free will, and they begin to show that motor reactions in the body indicate that you don't have free will. This is part of that deconstruction process. I believe that we have free will, that when we're talking about free will, we're talking about the consciousness which is given to us. Certainly, there are huge constraints on us, there are huge limitations. I can't go out and do anything that I want. There's a difference between liberty and license. There has to be, by definition, our liberty has to be conditioned to some extent by other people's needs and in the way that we live. So that's the essence of all traditions. But we have free will. So when we begin to say, well, we have the Kali Yuga and this is going to happen, in some ways, they create a deterministic model that fight against free will. I think we can interpret some of these things in different ways. Certainly, there are different cycles in the universe that they notice certain astronomical contexts, that they can have some effects for some strange reasons. But when we get into a situation where we believe that we don't have free will and something is going to happen, then we get very unprepared and lacking in resilience for the future. So I believe that those are ways of looking at things, that we have to approach them sometimes in a more poetic and less literalistic way. And so I know that certain people will say, well, there's no point in opposing that because that's written in the stars, that this thing should be like that. A lot of people who are very optimistic or who are quite into esoteric things told me that things were going to change in December 2020. Everything was going to be great in 2020, you know, and these are people that have had very interesting esoteric journeys that I respect. I didn't believe that, but there's a danger when you get into, I mean, I do prediction myself, and so, I mean, if I see a force, I'll try and identify it, and that's the nature to a certain extent of prophecy. But one has to be careful that we don't get deterministic. There are cycles, and that can help you interpret, but we are given this, or we have this consciousness. If you want to say it evolved, whatever, or we evolved the conditions to house this consciousness, but the free will gives to us that possibility of exploring and defeating the systems, defeating fate and destiny in that sense, not through necessarily mechanical means in the sense that the cosmos talked about, but through the exercise of the full potential and creativity of our own free will. So in that sense, I'm resistant to the idea that it is all written in the stars, that it is set. And I have great respect for those traditions. I see there's something we can learn from it, but generally they can be misused by a literalist mindset and be used. They can actually be used against us. They can be used to say, well, there's no reason, you can't, even within the esoteric circle. So we have to be careful that we don't relinquish free will, which is the classic manifestation of human personhood.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now, I want to circle back around to when we were talking about the Scientocracy exclusively, and how there's this globalization taking place, which you say is a tactic rather than a strategy. And I thought that was a unique way to think of it. I haven't heard of that before. Every time you hear globalization, it's always this great strategy to accomplish something. But anyway, what is it that's what's the driving force behind this? Some people say it's money, but that to me doesn't make any sense, that it would just be money. Power, maybe a little bit more, but is it something akin to how C.S. Lewis in the Screw Tape Letters talked about these demons, and how, you know, people have these certain demons that cater to their desires, that drive them to do certain things? Is it something like that? I know that's a little simplistic, but is it on a spiritual level, or is it like, how do you, why would you say this is even taking place? I know you said that there's dehumanization, but what do you think is the driving force? Is it some nefarious evil entities, or what?
Yes and no, but I'm not. If you look at, say, Rudolf Steiner, he described in terms of the Persian context of Ahriman and the Ahrimanic struggle, which he identified with science, and he anticipated that science would be that Ahrimanic force. That's the living in the material world, control of the material world. And he posited against that the idea of the Archangel Michael. So the Archangel Michael for him represented the archetypal resistance to this control. So the key thing for me is control. And in globalization and all this, in governance, is control. Cybernetics goes back to the Greek for control systems. Everything is about control. Now, you have to ask yourself, well, why are certain people so obsessed with control? Well, then this also fits into the idea, as we talked about, in relation to machines. You can control things. You don't have this vital force. And this is another element associated with personalism, that vitality, that idea that there is a vital force, which is a description of that consciousness in us, which is that creative force. It's the same as in the biosphere. It's that vital force. But science doesn't respect those ideas, and therefore doesn't respect the complexity of biology in the same way. And its modus operandi is through control tests, control systems. And from associated with that idea of control is, I think, a kind of psychological attitude which suggests that, well, if I can control these things, if I can make billions of people put all the details of their life on Facebook, for example. Well, I have an inherent capacity to govern. There's a governance gift that I have been giving. So that creates a cycle, but it ultimately stems from control. And if you look at globalization, the argument is, and up to very recently, people saying, oh, well, globalization is great because I can drink my New Zealand wine, I can travel on holidays. Now, all those things are not available to you now because it wasn't so valuable that they would let these things persist in this context. So it should ring alarm bells. And one of the great advocates of globalization, Pascal Lamy, who's associated with the World Trade Organization, European Union, he said a year or two ago that globalization, capitalism has to end. You know, we've gone too far with this. The idea that I was driven by some capitalist idea is a mistake too. So in both systems, capitalism and communism, we have a focus on the materialist world, and there's an oscillation between the two. To some extent, they're not opposed. They're two sides of the same coin. Now, scientism allows them join together in governance, where they can say, yes, still about the same thing, it's still about control. Now, if you go back to the 1920s, C.S. Lewis was around people that were advocating, like Huxley, and he communicated with Arthur C. Clarke, and he would have been around Bernal and those figures. And he saw what they were thinking, and he saw what they were writing. And it was from there that he began to understand what their purpose was, what their intention was. So they were driven by this force. Now, a lot of those people were very hostile to the idea of the spirit. They're very hostile to ideas of human dignity. Hence, they can talk about people living in the human zoo because they don't have any commitment to that idea. Now, you ask yourself, well, where does that come from? And it came in particular from the mid 19th century. It was associated with Darwinism, not particularly with what Darwin said, because remember, Darwin and Wallace, their theories of evolution were published at the same time, but Wallace couldn't be tolerated because he believed that the spirit existed. So he was written out of history largely, but their theories were published on the same night. It was read in the Linnaean Society in London the same night. So after that, people like Thomas H. Huxley, the anatomist who was really behind the evolution of scientific racism in a number of people's views, they began to say, well, you can have a hierarchy of races. Again, racism is another thing that we can trace back to science as opposed to humanity. It wasn't some inherent hatred in humans. It was constructed on the basis of an idea of authoritative knowledge and quantification. So they were very hostile to the idea that the spirit existed. There was a reaction to Darwinism, and there was a book in 1863 with the History of the Supernatural, which sought to argue that in every culture and around the world that people have believed in the spirit. And the reason why they were doing so was because there was an attack on the idea of the spirit existing at all. They said, well, we're just animals, we're material, we've come up from this, and therefore the spirit doesn't exist. Whether they always believed in that is difficult, because you have to remember that this was the height of the British Empire. And my argument is that what happened was there was a mutation of this imperial viewpoint, where they began to realize that over a period of 50 years, that it was difficult to control people. You could see that from the Irish situation. You could see that from opposition thereabouts, that it becomes messy to control people in that way. And then, of course, we had the First World War. Now Huxley worked to take the spirit out. So that was why psychology, the term psychic forces were used 1870 to get around the fact that the scientists wouldn't accept that the spirit existed, because they wanted to throw the baby out with the bathwater. They weren't prepared to countenance a situation where you would utilize any recognition of the spiritual nature of you. So it was excised, and anomectomy, I call it. So the spirit was excised from spiritual discourse. Now, the First World War, of course, you can look at all the different reasons why it happened. It's very, very difficult. They'll tell you all these different reasons. But one of the reasons why it happened was because scientists had put their willpower into creating armaments, and they continued to do so. Now, at the end of the First World War, then they began to realize that they could destroy the world. So there had to be a different technique. And Churchill, at that early on in the 20s, realized that the world could be destroyed with something no bigger than an orange. That's the word he used. And he began to understand. And he asked early on whether we were going to commit suicide through this scientific attachment. I mean, that's kind of written out the agenda. He also predicted that the next great empire would be the empire of the mind. So he understood what was happening. C.S. Lewis was around, and he began to understand that these people really meant to take control, the scientists. So it wasn't these. So John Desmond Bernal is a scientist. Julian Huxley, as well, the grandsons of T.H. Huxley, they were scientists, and to a certain extent, Aldous Huxley, the reason why he wrote his dystopian things, because he knew what was happening. He could see what was happening, and he was creating a question mark over this direction in history because he saw that it was a real force. So when some of these figures predict what's going to happen, they predict because they know that people are intending to do so. So the objective of that is to control, and the messiest thing on the earth is human beings, because people don't want to do what you tell them to do. Now, the Normans, from the time they came in 1066, they ruled Britain with a very small amount of people, and they established their early empire, if you like, with a very small amount of people, including using the Doomsday Book, which was where they went around all the lands and they noted what every farmer had everywhere, down to the last bale of hay. It was incredible data gathering exercise in 1086. So they did that as important, and they were able to control the systems. Control systems are critical. That imperial political idea has transmuted into science. Science is the empire. That's why I call it the empire of scientism. I'm not putting it in the court of all scientists. I'm saying that there is an ideology which has grown, capable of uniting capitalism, communism, which utilizes scientism to achieve its purpose. And again, Leon Trotsky was another person who was around that part of London where these figures were, had the same idea of creating superhumans. Nietzsche was there and thereabout, but this hatred of humans goes back to the Greeks. We can see it in Plato's dialogue. It's a long tradition, a long political tradition of disregard for other people. So control is the short answer. And sorry, to finish off, and you did ask me about the spiritual thing. Yeah, I do believe I'm influenced, I believe, by spiritual perceptions, by intuitions, whatever you want to call them. I might call them something more, but we'll use it in those terms. And other people are influenced by their things. So in the Ephesians 6:12 or whatever it is about principalities, there's a lot of evidence that people are influenced by otherworldly forces. I'm not going to say that there are otherworldly forces controlling this, because then you get into territory you don't have to do. On Occam's razor, look at what's happening in the world. But people are motivated by different things. So there is a struggle. I call it the war of the spirit. You can say light, dark, whatever you want. There is a struggle going on. It's the classic struggle going back to the Persian ideas of Ahriman, of emphasizing the material, the thing, as against the person and the spirit. And Jacques Ellul said that where technique and technology comes in contact with the organic is ousted. Even in process, making bread of it, can't tolerate the organic. So the personalist focused on the organism, the whole thing, but it suffers when technique and technology come together. It's inherent, without getting into the spiritual domain, it's inherent in the nature of this system and the mindset, but they begin to operate in a vortex, and there's definitely influences from abroad, from above, from inside, that emphasize those materialist dimensions. We can see that, of course, going back to the Gnostics and the early Gnostics as well. They had a similar belief.
Right. Yeah. And with regards to transhumanism, you brought up something that I was thinking about for a while now, regarding evolution. In Charles Darwin, it seems to me, and this may be a silly way of thinking, but as you were stating, that there's this sort of hatred for man and trying to be something greater than man, and that's the transhuman, to go beyond human, the overman, or and so it seems to me, if you're working off of that foundation of Charles Darwin's evolution, that it makes sense that man would come to a point where they would transcend their species, because in that belief system, you have apes, primates before they were man. We evolved from primates to man. And what I was thinking, I was like, so there would have to be some sort of trans primate at that time. Now, these may be silly thoughts, and feel free to criticize them all you want, but I agree with you that there's this spiritual evolution that's taking place, and that's what's missing from the transhumanists. That there is this evolution that's, like you were saying, I think that is coming to fruition on a conscious, on a spiritual level, and I think that that's the real journey that one goes through evolutionarily. Anyway, and so in regards to like the animal zoo that you've also referred to, I think that that's if that transhumanist agenda is successful, they're then going to look at humans that chose not to, get enhanced, if you will, as animals, the same way that we look at chimps in a zoo. And there's this fairy tale idea that I've seen people present that are very smart, and they even believe in the spiritual realm. The first person that comes to my mind is like Ben Gortzel. I've read some of his work, and he talks about that there should be, as we evolve into these transhumans, we should allow other people not to enhance themselves. We should be able to all live harmoniously with one another. But that to me seems to be a little naive in thinking, because you can't guarantee it, because a certain game theory comes into play. When another intelligent being is around a lesser intelligent being, you don't know what's going to come of that. And typically what we see in human nature is this idea to dominate. So, if you want to piggyback off of that a little bit.
Yeah. We can even see it now without getting into that issue. You can see it already in relation to, say, people that are vaccinated and people that are not vaccinated.
Right.
We have this dichotomized. Now, this is coming from the Irish context. This is the classic instrument of empire, to divide and rule. It's always done so. And if there's a curious thing that's never sufficiently explained by transhumanists. It's the idea of, why do they jump from the idea of a libertarian, anarchic individual wanting to enhance their body to an idea that everyone has to have it? Now, there's a jump. They jump from one to another. So they say, oh yeah, it's to liberate, and then they show pictures of people having their hearing restored, which is great, for example, but that knowledge came from people who were studying the ear for thousands of years, principally applying mechanical means. Restoration is not enhancement. Restoration of normal expectations is not technical enhancement, which is transhumanism. That's one distinction that's made. And then they say, well, there'll be a species kind of shift. Now, how is the species shift going to happen? It can only happen by imperial intervention. It can only happen by definition if it happens for a sufficiently wide group of people. And what they're giving away there is that really what they're anticipating, or what the direction of it is the utilization of an intervention in the human body to make control systems work better, so that you're not as messy as you were before. You're more predictable, you're more limited. You don't have all the messy elements that are not mere computation, so that you can work as a node, as a servant of the system, of the technosphere, and maybe a cast of people who will retain some elements. They could, of course, use humans as pets, or as Bernal said, they would be able to use the other humans as experiments, for human experiments. They could also use them for body parts for the humans that want to have their immortality in some way. by constant transplantation, for example, of some of the other noble, and especially if we don't have an idea of human dignity, that's going to happen. And there's, of course, allegations in various countries about how prisoners or body parts are used for elites. I mean, these are contemporary complaints and arguments. So, I mean, it's not an issue of the future. So, and then you have, well, so what I find strange about the evolutionary notion is they say, okay, well, it's clear we've been going on this pattern of evolution, and then they fight for a generation or two to establish this as a dominant paradigm, that we evolve over a period of time. And then all of a sudden, they say, well, that means now we have to break that natural selection and intervene artificially. It doesn't go together, but it does go together if you interpret, as I would argue, these things as manifestations of the creation of an empire, the final empire, the empire of scientism, which utilizes these ideas, which can be liberating, certain, or could be liberating, but effectively have the objective of depersonalizing people, of taking away the messy bits. And if you see that as well in A Clockwork Orange, the idea that you have a bad bit in you, we'll program it, we'll technically take it out of you. And they're openly saying this. They're openly saying that we will be able to re-engineer people. So it sounds like they just take the bad bits out and you'll have the good bits back. But I mean, this is again a flawed idea of people, and we have the shadow side. The shadow side is what creates a lot of it, what drives people. Often some of the great people in history have been driven by negative forces, by driven by narrow ideas, driven by obsessiveness. So obsessiveness creates the best in us and the worst of us. So some of these things go over, but I don't find the idea plausible that there's a group of people out there who really want to allow us to live as immortal beings. It really is, when they're at the same time, a lot of the same people argue that there's gross overpopulation and we have to decrease the population. And this was even Huxley, because when Huxley was asked, he said the greatest challenge facing the earth was overpopulation, and he emphasized, and that was what his brother taught. And this has been an interest of the kind of elite in the British Empire very much. There's too many people out there, it's kind of dangerous. We have to control them. So there is this Malthusian idea that war is good, it reduces population, use your weaponry and practice your scientific math. See, does it work in reality? A Malthusian idea, a kind of Nietzschean idea, an idea of the magician. And again, Arthur C. Clarke said that sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. That idea of the magician that can control the world, that reflects, as Prospero did in The Tempest, that controls the environment. We have Bill Gates. So he can make clouds do his bidding, and Bill Gates is talking about putting stuff up in the atmosphere. Again, this is part of the mentality. There's a mentality that they can intervene in very complex systems and they will achieve results. So there is a desire to intervene and make a technical intervention, and this is noted with the cult of expertise as well. They believe that by a technical intervention they can solve problems, and often those interventions don't work. And with some of this science, for example, the idea that science will cure the environmental problem, we have the danger that they'll make things worse. And to finish off on that point, if we look at certain scientists like John C. Lilly, for example, who was involved in a lot of these domains, consciousness studies, etc., he believed we would be living in a glass domes and run by a solid state entity. And this idea we can see in E.M. Forster in 1906, who was going to be a machine that controlled the world. We can see it in 1863, Samuel Butler, his essay on Darwin and the Age of the Machines in New Zealand. We can see it a little bit later in George Eliot. Machines would, so they were aware that the next stage would be involve an effort by humans, because this occurs well, and that suggests that it's organic in some way. Oh, this singularity is just happening. Again, borrowing an idea which was in religious terms as well, in spiritual terms, you can find ideas of singularity. But so this idea that it's inevitably happened, so you can't do anything about it. There's nothing you can do. It's inevitable. That it's almost organic. So that as well is a kind of magical feel. But in Kurzweil's ideas, you can see a very strong strand of the magician controlling the idea of the emergence of a godlike figure in a godlike context, where you have no choice, and that is a warning that in God and Golem, for example, that book that Norbert Wiener said that you have to be careful about this magician tendency from people that are involved in technology, or the technocracy, if you want, because that desire, it goes back, it's the classic Dr. Faustus, Christopher Marlowe, around similar era of The Tempest. They realized that people would sacrifice their soul. They would sacrifice their soul and other souls for the power, for the knowledge of power, for science. And that Faustian pact, as Spengler explained, was an inherent kind of philosophical drive in Western culture. And not just in Western culture, because Chinese have it as well. And they also love John Desmond Bernal. So yeah, I agree with you. And in that is a conflict between the natural and the artificial. And all the people that have argued for natural selection, etc., as an explanation, all of a sudden believe that everything must be artificial, made by man. And although we have created great things, when we begin to interfere with life, we fail to see that life is an incredible organic process, which is superior. The way biology works has things we can't understand. And we have failed to investigate or utilize a knowledge of biology in the way that indigenous people understand it, an alternative way, consistent with spiritual evolution, consistent with the environment, because we've fallen for these toys and gadgets, gimmicks, gizmos, and the people, we've elevated the people that want to interact in the world and that with those devices.
Right, and that's why I kind of remain dubious of like these anti-aging agenda, this biohacking of immortality, trying to reverse aging. I had the privilege of interviewing Dr. Aubrey de Grey, and I think the work he's doing is, I would like to see some life extension. I think that's a cool idea. However, I remain dubious simply because what I'm hearing is what the body already does in some instances. Like a lot of our cells already regenerate themselves. Our germ cells, they're immortal. They just continue on. And so a lot of like what I'm hearing is like, okay, we want to increase the health span, yet we're going to have to kill certain cells. I think it's like stem cell deletion. And then you're going to have a process every 10 years of renewing those stem cells, so the process of aging doesn't come into play. But then that just, I guess, enhances this scientocracy, which you're referring to, this transhumanism, where you need to constantly go to the doctor and get enhanced, or else you're going to die. And what I see coming out of this, and what I see you implying in some of what we've been talking about here, is this sort of breakaway civilization that's going to take place with those who choose not to maybe go with these longevity therapies or enhancement, if you will, enhancements for transhumanism. So do you see this last empire of scientocracy, the elites at the top, breaking away and forming their own civilization, and then you have Earth as this animal zoo, if you will?
Well, I think they have. I mean, I think they have. Remember that the Norman model, it still exists in Britain, for example. That structure of governance still exists in Britain, nearly 1,000 years later. And again, we talked about the Catholic Church, and its system has been around for quite a while. The breakaway civilization was an element in J.D. Bernal's vision in The World of Flesh and the Devil as well. He was quite clear. So it's not a new idea. It was there right at the start. This is inherent in the idea that goes together: transhumanism, breakaway civilization, treat humans as animals. There had to be a break. He was clear on that. There's no question about that. So there's no question that where humans with dignity are going to become slaves, pets, whatever you call it. There is no question. And we're not far off that, because in the last year or two, our rights have been taken away in the Western world. This was a thing that grew up over a long period of time. And certainly, going back to Roman law, you could have a dictator during periods of emergency to take control of the state. But we don't have that mechanism. It's been taken away. They won't come back because people have been very lax to defend their rights. And this idea of rights has been attacked. Humanism, the idea that there is that idea of humanism has been attacked on ideological grounds from the left and the right. And again, they all have the same effects, that the person ends up in a worse situation. The reason why a lot of rights exist was not to elevate individuals above animals or whatever. It was to defend people against power. That was what a lot of struggles were, to defend people against the power of the state, the power of the royalty, the power of the commonwealth, whatever. So the breakaway civilization is, and the other element was space travel. So they're all happening before our eyes. Again, in that short book, The World of Flesh and the Devil, that's in 1929, he lays it out about why space travel is so important. And then you can begin to see what's happening. They're following the script. The script is there. And all of these things end up with the human, as Anders talked about, as Lull talked about. We will be imprisoned, enslaved, and abolished, basically. Save if we are kept to serve the elite caste. Now, how can you argue that, oh, well, we have to reduce resources and then claim that you can extend the life of, 7 bit, or even that it's good? Or they say, well, we'll be able to have it so that women age 75 will be able to have babies. And you say, well, is that a good purpose, for example? And a lot of this goes back to the spiritual tradition. And a lot of people who believe that the material world is the totality have a great fear of death. And they have a great fear of death because they don't believe in life after death. They don't believe in spirits. And because they have a great fear of death, they will do anything. And when you say anything, you mean anything. Some people, I'm not talking about, I'm not vilifying or saying bad things about the motivation of all transhumanists, but there are a certain group of people that will do anything to prolong their life because they have a great fear of non-existence. Now, if you have gone through that process, you want to call it ego, of transcendence, or if you've opened and you believe that you're a spiritual being, you shouldn't have a fear of death. I mean, you might have a fear of dying in a nasty way, but or whatever, or you don't want to be a steamroller to knock you down or whatever. There's particular ways you choose not to, if you have a choice. But the fear of death itself, it doesn't coexist with the idea that you're a spiritual being. So spiritual people, now that of course is contradicted by the cosmos that you mentioned, because if you go back to Fedorov and those in the 19th century, they believed that they could use mechanical means to replace mortality. Now, some of these spiritual figures that became transhumanists, I don't trust them as on spiritual terms. And another example who I don't is Taylor de Chardin, who is celebrated again, one of these figures that everyone loves. I don't like what he said. I don't like what he said in relation to his vision, and it seemed to be, again, a collectivized idea of consciousness, and control was inherent in it. And he was criticized. One person that did criticize him was Bernard Charbonneau, the friend of Ellul, who saw where technology was going. So some of these things come together, but it may be that what will happen, I have said in the Mystical Accord, I had a haiku to the effect that the coming age is one of mercenaries and castles, and I've painted on that subject as well. There is a kind of neo-feudal feel, again, about, if you want to call it cycles, in relation to things we can identify that there will be a special class. They will be you can see it already in the way there's different rules for certain people during the COVID restrictions. They could do certain things. And it's no accident that we had the 5G during that period, that we had Elon Musk putting up all his satellites. They go together. There are different rules, and people must become aware. It's there in them in the face at this stage that there is there are people. I mean, they're not doing it secretly, and even Snowden has said it's in plain sight now about how people are going to control, how we're living in this surveillance society, how everything we do is controlled. And people say, oh, well, it's great that we can talk to each other. But I mean, the technology was always going to evolve so we would be able to talk to each other. But we didn't envisage necessarily that everything we say would be recorded. We said it privately or intended to be privately and utilized against us, or algorithms would manage it. That surveillance society is part of the idea, as Yuval Noah Harari wrote in his essay in 2018, that technology tends towards totalitarianism. And that happens. So this fear of death is something that I don't get. And maybe I could have got it when I was a child, but I don't get it. And it's a thing, if you believe in that your spirit persists, that consciousness exists, or if you look at near-death experiences, my mother had one of them years ago, and I remember her telling me about it. And again, when I was small, you have the idea, you begin to understand, as most mystics have, that the spirit is separable in some way from the human body. And you can see that in the Gospel of Thomas and the non-standard Gospels, where Jesus says, if they ask you where you came from, say you came from the place where light came into being of its own accord, and that it's amazing that this body can house such a thing. There's the idea that the spirit is a separate entity. It's a very strong tradition. Now, we are incarnated, whatever way it works, we're incarnated. We have to be here and now. We have to accept who we are and work within that context. And again, I would support utilization of these resources, not to prolong the life of billionaires, but to help people that need to be cured of blindness or of hearing problems or have a bad heart. Or that's not transhumanism. That's restoration of normal function, normal expectations using the contemporary technology that's available. So that obfuscation is another thing that they do. Oh, look at us, we only want to help people. No, the main motivation is a control mechanism, and to control as well the life and death, to control mortality is a great dream. Going back to Faustus, going back to magicians, going back to, well, it is in the spiritual tradition. The Taoists did want to seek immortality in some way, although it's difficult. When we're reading them in translations, it's difficult to know what they meant necessarily, or whether it's reliable. But they did certainly believe in living a full, healthy life, and they did believe in, some of them did seek immortality through various means. But what the nature of that immortality was is another question. And I don't, when I read the Russian cosmos, the early ones, or I find it difficult, this idea of the resurrection of the dead in physical form, I find a strange one. And I mean, the planet is, if we have overpopulation now and we get all these spirits back, it'll be a bit difficult. So it doesn't even seem appropriate or desirable. And as an artist, or as a poet, as you're a poet, we know that limitation is critical in creativity. Limitations are what produces great art. When you're writing your haiku, and you have written haikus, as far as I know, that the fact that you're writing in, say, 17 syllables and 3 lines or whatever is what gives it its power. So our limitation is a definite period of life, well, variable, but an average period of life. And we can make that as long as we want or as short as we want, depending on the attitude we bring to it. And the mystics believe that they can in some way go beyond time and space, or have a sense of that. This is what a lot of the tradition is, where you lose that fear of death. You lose the idea of that you're going to fade away and disappear, or your life is just a vapor. Certainly the physical form will vanish like a vapor in that sense, but that's comforting in another sense. It might be more comforting as the world develops on its current trajectory, if they let us go.
Right. Yeah. I like what you're saying as far as, the restoration of certain abilities when it comes to hearing or vision, or if somebody's paralyzed, they're talking about using the neural link, and there's other devices to restore functionality to the body. And you're calling it as it is, restoration. And I must say, I've never looked at it that way. I always sort of, associated that with the transhumanist movement, which made me more accepting to it in certain ways, because myself, I wear glasses. My eyesight's not the greatest, and so I always viewed that as like maybe a form of transhumanism. But then, as you rightfully say, it's just so obvious after you said it. It's restoration. It's not really anything magnificent in the regard of enhancing. It's just putting you where you should be, and that's good enough in my estimation. That's if you can just run as you're supposed to, that's good. Now, I've had I've interviewed the co-founder of the Mormon Transhumanist Party, and one of the questions I asked him is, if Mormons, they believe that there's a pre-existence of the soul, and therefore if there's a pre-existing to the soul, there must be an after, like there has to be something after this life itself. It just would complete the cycle. And why then try and break the cycle doing transhumanism? Like that never really made sense to me. However, I do see some compatibility between transhumanist ideas and religious ideas. But I agree with you that a lot of this has to do with a fear of death. And I've always, in general, I find it odd that you have these religious transhumanist movements when, if you just follow that tradition, you're going to live forever in most of them. And my study is that there's just this continuation of life after this life. It just goes, whether it be reincarnation, resurrection, whatever you interpret that as. Now, you brought up COVID, and I think a lot of the fear of what's taking place. So some people say, it's all a scam. Other people say it's not, and they're using it to fulfill their agenda. Now, how do you view this pandemic? Because if you actually look at the numbers, it's not even that bad, really. If you go with the paradigm, because there's certain people who don't believe viruses are contagious. And if I'm being transparent, I think that makes more sense to me based on the information I have, in that viruses are dead. And so you can't really transfer something that's dead, but I know there's a debate in medicine on that. Anyway, so do you see this being, used to just further this agenda, or is there some validity to it, or what's your take on this?
Okay, just to go back on one issue about the Mormon Transhumanist Association, which I have come across as well. One interesting point about that is, remember that a number of religions in the United States were founded by people that had been involved in magic. Like Joseph Smith had been involved in magic. There's debate about it, but he was involved, as a lot of people, where he came from, in use of ceremonial magic. And the other, of course, the Church of Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard, was very much into magic. So that magic and religious context goes together. In relation to, but I do find it difficult. You also find in the Mormons their interest in the kind of retro application of, in the genealogical context of bringing everyone in, which fits in as well with the cosmism idea of the ancestors coming back. So there's elements of it that make sense and elements that don't make sense. It's a materialization of a spiritual idea. When you say about glasses, for example, yes, of course, they're prosthetic devices. And if you think about it philosophically, you can begin to come to certain principles even from that. So the idea that everyone should have 20/20 vision, maybe if your family has been engaged in doing some very close work for thousands of years, maybe it impacts on the selection in the process, which leads to a particular thing, which is not 20. But you can see, once you come to the idea that there's a 2020 standard, well, then there's a standard that will be applied, for example. There may have been other reasons why people had different eyesight that made perfect sense in different environments. But yes, it is a prosthetic device. Of course, artificial limbs, artificial eyes, whatever, the whole hooks on the hand. And this was studied in, or this comes up a lot in Moby Dick. And there's a book recently written about prosthesis using literature to argue that nearly everything is prosthesis. And this is an argument that I don't like, because when you, and Freud talked about prosthesis as well, but when you begin to say everything is prosthesis, you begin then to justify, well, this is just another prosthesis to have your, so that's another obfuscation. It's a trick that's there. In relation to the current crisis, now I don't want to alert the algorithm to make it difficult for you. But let me put it this way, and this is to answer the question by stuff that I did before in my book, Blue Light September, before this crisis. I said the plot in the book, and again, it's a difficult book. I'm not saying it's a great book. It certainly will never be a successful book, but I put out there my ideas. There was a natural disaster. So there was a real natural disaster at the start of the book, and most people won't read it, so I won't be giving them, not. But so there's no debate about that. In my other book, Ireland, I Don't Recognize Who She Is, which was written beforehand as well. I also had, it was set in the future, dystopian future, which you can imagine that a lot of my futures are dystopian, but I did have Australian fruit bat virus, and they were getting vaccinated in the future for that one. So I wasn't far off there. I just chose a particular natural disaster for other artistic purposes that I'll explain sometime in the future. But so there was a real natural disaster, which led to the draconian response and legislation and implication, utilization of that crisis to utilize in that context implantation again in the human body. Well, I wrote that before the process. So what I'm suggesting is that if it's very, very strong in my imagination as a reality, it is, and then something unfolds which is uncannily like this, where we had lockdowns in London. Again, I concentrate on the London area. And draconian legislation and the abolition of rights and strange new powers and strange new forces coming. It wasn't far off the mark, but I had come to that through a variety of reasons and sensations. So remember that the history of, in the last few hundreds of years, thousands of years, the history has been associated with empires, with colonization. Colonization, and again, coming from an Irish context, my family would have been involved in the struggle for independence, all that kind of stuff. So they're very familiar, they were very familiar with thinking about fighting against an empire and how it works. And their lives would have been directly affected over generations by that. So you do become a bit aware of it. Now, for example, one technique that the empire used was to put people from one place into another people. That's plantation. The plantations of Ulster. That's where the problem. It didn't come from religion. The plantations and that mechanism was pre-existing the religious dimension. But you can make things into something else by engineering social situations and political situations. And of course, that plantation method was used in the United States. So and they combined it with the slavery mechanism. Of course, slavery was very familiar in the Roman imperial system, but the plantation system was a continuation of this way of controlling. Now, so the world has been colonized. So the final colony is us. We are the colonial destination. It's the colonization. There used to be a television series where they get into a little craft and move around the body. I forget what the name of it was, when they move around inside the body as if the body is a giant. Because they're reduced, they move around. And to some extent, that's what's happening. Our mind is being colonized. Our body is being colonized. That imperial system is directed, has to be directed towards that. And that's consistent with what the scientists say. To make the, and you can say, well, I'm making the world safer, I'm controlling people or controlling the world, etc. Now, as a lawyer, take it from a medical perspective. I listened to the Swedish epidemiologists at the start of the crisis, and I was utterly convinced from what they said. Now, I had come to my own conclusions, but to refer to what medical people trained, there was a more senior chap. Now, everyone goes on about the benefit of young people. I prefer older heads in some of these issues because they have experience of what happened before. And he believed that it was ridiculous to lock down, to struggle against not to let it pass through. And I think he influenced the independent Swedish agency. And as a result, early on, there was a very lax attitude. They weren't as afraid about it. Now, of course, there's been international pressure to bring them up. But his view was that you couldn't fight it against it in that way. You had to let it pass through. It wasn't that bad looking at the statistics. I haven't changed my mind on that since. So the argument is not really about the existence of this thing for me. It's about the use of this. As a lawyer, this has been used to take away our rights. It's been used for other agendas. Your rights have been taken away. We've allowed, or we're going to have, a global administration system which will have biodata about you. There's discrimination against people that don't abide by the propaganda model. There's a process of excommunication almost of people. It's the same as a religious authority. And there has been an utterly depressing techno-totalitarianism in it. There's no question about that. So without getting into the gory details, I'm convinced by those experienced epidemiologists at the start that said, that looked at the models. And then again, if you look at, there's another interesting thing. The main models in Britain came from Imperial College. I'll say it again, they came from Imperial College. Imperial College. I mean, it's telling you. And these mathematical models have been grossly off in a lot of context. And we're living in this, I can't read newspapers anymore. I look at television, when all this pseudo-scientific stuff that hasn't been opposed, graphs, things that look authoritative. There's evidence, and then there's presentation of evidence. And we've been subjected to the great distortion of that. And there's a book called Beautiful Evidence by Tuft, who talked about the dangers of misrepresenting evidence in visual presentations. And he argued that NASA had, or one of the space shuttles crashed as a result of misrepresentation of information and PowerPointing. That the way you present information can be very, very dangerous. If I had that premonition beforehand that there would be draconian legislation, which the objective of would be to create that intervention in the human body. That was the purpose of it. So the end is not anything about what the particular problem is. The end is to increase the system of control. Now, the historical analogy, I think you could pick up a number of historical analogies. There are some historians who argue that, I think it was an earthquake in Tokyo which led to a crisis, which led to a more authoritarian government in Japan, which led to the particular type of government they had in the 30s and that. So a crisis is always useful. So there's a difference between a natural disaster, which nobody can dispute that has happened, and something which comes in the way that it does. The argument that it has come from a fish market, whatever which happens to be across the road from a biolab is well, right. Intelligent people can make up their own mind on that. And funny enough, when I did see a report arguing about that it was, the bats they were experimenting on, they showed a picture And it was a fruit bat as far as I could see, like in my Australian fruit bat virus. But the question again is, why is it so important for scientists to torture these poor old bats that are minding their own business for some purpose? And if it escaped, or a medical whatever, and it wasn't delivered, even still, the question is, what is so important that we have to torture nature to achieve these things? And why is it that we're willing to take risks with all these things? And why is it that this Promethean idea that drives science, that they can experiment? I understand that at some stage people will understand how that you can make the atom bomb, but there's a great Faustian, Promethean satisfaction in the achievement of these, which is more consistent with the idea of Faust, of magic, of power, that drives these things. And there is no question, for me, we're living in a dictatorship, the digital dictatorship, if you want, that Harari talked, but it is we are there now. We're in the science talk. Now you can say, well, this will blow over, but the systems are systems to control us. It has had effects already. It's beginning to divide and conquer. It's beginning to accumulate power to the big pharma, big tech. They're coalescing, they're converging, and there's no question that global governance system is there already, that it has happened. So our rights have been taken away. So a bit of me doesn't really care about the reality. I don't. There seems to be something out there that's causing trouble. But as against that, if you look at the way they gather the evidence, for example, they abolished the system in Ireland, or that they suspended the autopsy system, which would lead to a more specific cause of death scenario. They've given incentives in other countries for people to classify something as particular results. So I can't rely either on the evidence of how many deaths are. They're just purely unreliable. In relation to models, any model is only accurate insofar as the assumptions underlying it are robust, and they're not robust, and they've been shown not to be robust. And in all this, the great scientists, of course, there's voices out there, but the great scientists have been strangely quiet. And this is a thing that and I've noticed, actually, listening to some conversations of scientists in some of the contexts I've talked to, it reinforced my view that Ellul had, that scientists beyond the domain of their speciality are often incredibly banal. They're often incredibly poor. So there's this glorification. When someone comes and does some fantastic mathematics, we're certainly impressed. But that can lead to an air of authority where people don't question. When they go beyond the domain, they're often very, very poor. Science doesn't have any commitment inherently to ethics. It doesn't have any commitment to the person. It doesn't have any commitment to rights. It doesn't have any commitment to protecting the citizen. So why we should expect it is crazy. And so these events have been utilized to take away our freedoms. Now, we may get them back in some way. There may be a relinquishing of immediate control for some time, but there has been a great shift in the centralization of power and the establishment of an apparatus of power, and that's not going to go away. And Australia was a prison colony that a lot of the Irish were sent out, and I have relations there. So yeah, apparently they have the army going around, helicopters in the sky. So it's a more effective prison colony these days. And an interesting thing, when they sent the Irish and English prisoners out there, there was one place, I think Port Arthur, which was out from the mainland. So they sent them to the most deserted places. And interestingly, I always remember reading about the treatment, the scientific treatment. They were trying to apply ideas, utilitarian ideas of Bentham, etc., to penology, and they're arguing that this was an enlightened way to treat the prisoners, keeping them separate. They forbade them to talk. They made them more masks. They made them wear over 100, or go back to the 1800s, they made them wear hoods when they were in social context, because they realized that that was an effective way to segregate them. There's no question that this apparatus is happening universally. I've always followed what's happened in Australia, Ireland, Sweden, United States, Canada. You can see it. Surprisingly, you can see great repression in the former British Empire, in Canada, in the United States, in Australia, and that does raise questions. Ireland has been shocking. I've lost all respect for the leaders in the Irish context, for the toleration, for the political establishment. It doesn't live up to the promise of what the guys were fighting for. It's a shame. So it shows you as well that political struggle is no use if it doesn't focus on spiritual enlightenment. If it's not driven by spiritual forces, the use of counter power of a revolutionary, violent thing will ultimately lose out to superior forces in some way. And the easiest way to do that is they realize is to be able to make people materially comfortable and to fight against the spiritual base that may make people independent. I don't know if that answers your question in relation to yes. This is it. We've moved into it. Anyone that doesn't see that needs a bigger pair of glasses than they really need to get. They need to get a deeper. I'm talking about the eyes of the soul. They need to get examined on those things, and they're the spiritual eyes that.
Right. Yeah, and I personally have experienced the loss of rights during the lockdown in America. In Ohio, where I'm at, it's weird in Ohio because you go in the southern part of Ohio, it's more similar to like a Tennessee or a Texas kind of environment. I'm not sure if that helps you at all. I'm not.
Yes, yeah, no, yeah, I do.
Okay. So, but in the northern half, it's more of like a New York, a California kind of feel to it. If that, not completely, but
no, I understand. Yes, yeah,
yes. And so we live in Northeast Ohio, and when the whole issue of the mask came out, at first I was going with it because I trusted them. I was like, okay, I don't know anything about this. I'm not going to pretend I do. And I'm just going to listen to the information coming in. And I found some alternative sources that I thought were more trustworthy than the mainstream media. I've always been, skeptical of mainstream media because there's always some sort of, in media, interesting, I'm sure you know this, comes from the goddess media, which is the goddess of illusion. And so, that's pretty interesting that we named that media, that platform. But anyway, so I would listen to alternative sources, and they were saying this is all very legit. We should start taking precaution. And my wife and I, before it even came to America in like January, we were like, this is serious. Like we need to be locking down. Like we were totally hypnotized with the message, because we were like listening to other sources and we were like, this is coming. We knew it was coming, but we were for it. And so when it actually came, we were already more informed at that point. We were like, oh my gosh, we sort of helped this because not that, we could have done anything to prevent it had we not have supported the idea because it was already coming, but we were in line with the people who were supportive of it. And then by the time it came here, we were like, wow, this is wrong. Like just open to the information. But I think a big problem with today is there's so much information. People just get comfortable with the information from people they like to hear information from and trust. And anything contrary to that, they have blinders on like a horse. And so they just don't acknowledge it. And that's a huge issue. But getting to where I've personally experienced this, I was fired from my job because I told them I would not wear a mask for religious reasons and also medical reasons. And initially, this started with taking my temperature because I knew where this was going at that point. I was like, okay, there's a trajectory that we're on, and if we're just going to follow it, I'm eventually going to lose my job because they want to get me, with a jab, and I'm not definitely doing that. So might as well just stop it at the very beginning. And so eventually, I try to, negotiate with my company, and they basically told me if I don't, the VP of the company literally told me if I don't change my belief, I can't work at the company anymore. I'll be fired effective immediately. And I was like, well, I'm fired. I'm not changing my belief system. I feel like that's selling my soul. And another situation my wife and I were in, because we were very against the mask once we really learned what was going on. And as you were, I think, alluding to yourself with the slavery, and it's just unhealthy. Our doctor actually is like, don't wear mask. Like they're very bad for you to wear the mask. And so we went to Walmart during all of this, and I had gone into Walmart numerous times before with no issue. I was always the oddball out, never wearing a mask in public. But this one time in particular, we had the police called on us because we went in there with no mask. And we literally went in, bought a tent. Well, we tried to buy a tent at the self-checkout, and because I knew nobody would service us. And so as I'm going through the transaction, the worker comes over, cancels the transaction as my card's in there, and they're like, the cops are coming, you're just going to have to leave. And so I'm just sharing these two stories with you because I've personally been affected by, my wife, my family, have experienced the loss of rights. Regardless if you assert your rights, you can recite the Constitution, you can do all of these things, but it falls on deaf ears. And I think this has a lot to do with the fact that lawyers aren't really doing their job. I'm not a lawyer, so maybe I'm speaking out of turn here, but I feel like there's a failure on the part of lawyers to defend the rights of, at least in my country, the United States, the citizens of my country. And I also see something similar too with science, as you were talking about. There's a lot of pseudoscience. What a lot of people are unaware of is that there's a reproducibility crisis in science, where basically 2/3 of all scientific research or studies can't be reproduced. Therefore, they're invalid, yet they fly by and they're treated as actual science. And I think a lot of the reason why we're experiencing these things is because we're in dying institutions. We're in institutions that have just become so corrupted, and now they're morphing. They're trying to survive and break off into something new and create a new system, which arguably is necessary to keep from going into total anarchy, because you don't want your social institutions to crumble and then have people try and form something on their own. So where I'm getting at with this is, do you see anything that could be done to, because it's happening, it's inevitable that these institutions are dying, that the new system that's going to emerge could be more beneficial for us as opposed to where we're heading now? Do you see any? I know you at the beginning, you've answered some of this, but yeah, do you see anything that could maybe change it, or what are your thoughts on that? I know there's a lot there. So
no, I mean, do you mean, is there any reason why we shouldn't just throw in the towel? There's a number of things. Funny enough, when I went over to see Jeff Mishlove in New Mexico in January 2020, and I did a series of interviews then. And when I was in transit, my wife, who does look at alternative media, said, "Oh, there's this stuff. Be careful." And again, I laughed at it, but so she did. This is the same kind of pattern, and I don't know what his name, Sticks Hexenhammer or whatever his name is, one of the alternative guys.
I know who you're talking about.
Yeah. But notice about him, I listen again. I hear some of these things in the background going on, and but that chap, as far as I remember, was always kind of pro science in some ways, despite the appearance of that, so there is a curious conundrum there. So when it happened, I was curious why there was not more response, exact same as you. And I said, what about this? What do you think is going on here? And people say, oh, it's no concern. Now, fast forward, not fast forward, 18 months later, it's a reverse situation where I'm not concerned and everyone in the street are telling me what they've seen on the news because the propaganda model has come into the thing. Sweden has been more balanced in some sense. I did wear a mask once when I was going with my daughter to the dentist, but I didn't apart from that. But in relation to the lawyers, whether they're men or women, they've lost their balls, and they have, and it's disgraceful, and it's a shame. There was a legal system in Ireland before the common law system came, and the common law system, the norms came in 1179, and the common law system grew up in the part that they ruled in Ireland, which was called the Pale, because there was a palisade around it. So the expression beyond the pale refers to the Irish people that weren't within the sticks around Dublin and that. But the common law system grew up and displaced the pre-existing system that was there, the legal system that was there. So these things happen. It might take a long time. The system can crumble. But when the rights are not enforced or enforceable, they're going to be lost. It's common in the context of an emergency that rights will be displaced. But there's also a false idea about the extent to which we have had rights, because when I go back when I was a boy in Northern Ireland, not that far up the road, although I'm from Dublin, but I mean it's only an hour or two's journey up. They had internment, which was, imprisonment without trial. So that's in my lifetime on the island of Ireland. So you get picked up off the street and put in jail with no trial, and that contributed towards the success of the IRA in that phase, because they were so draconian. But rights can be taken away like that, and there's no question that they have been taken away seriously. But the United States has only been around for a couple of centuries and a bit, so it's not been around for a long time. People make assumptions about how persistent they are. It's clear that in a global governance situation, you don't want the people who are independent and have the ability to enforce their rights. So that can't be tolerated in a global governance system. So such rights that has existed are being diminished. And it is funny that, again, another interesting thing about information technology, all the great benefits, it's funny that when information technology is utilized in elections, that it creates more discontent than existed when people were writing with their pen and paper, because for obvious reasons. But I sympathize with it. It's terrible that you had to face that, but I would point out what Arendt said, Hannah Arendt, when she talked about totalitarianism. She said, the greatest problem you have at the start of a totalitarian regime is that you will have problems with people that you were close to, your family, your employers, because there you will meet it and you will be shocked by the force which is utilized against you in those contexts. It's not a thing that people think, because they usually see the bad guys marching down with batons, but the nature of totalitarianism is that it infiltrates into those things. And there is historic wrongs being committed in this sense, in this era, which on a personal or a social or a political level will be very, very difficult to correct or to restore in that sense. So it forces people to take a stand, and it's funny that we talk about transhumanism, and my fear is of network transhumanism, I call it, where you make everyone mass transhumanism. You compel people because they have the system already. It's shown that they can make massive amount of people adhere to a model despite questions about by utilizing forces of control and normalization process technique. They know how to do this to make it seem normal that you do something. And this is the classic way that totalitarian systems have happened. So network transhumanism involves implantation. And notice implantation has the same word plantation in it. It's gone into the body. It's the colonization of the individual. And that's what we're facing. So why they have, the transhumanists have said, well, the workers in the future will only be able to have workers get the job if they get enhanced to perform some function. Maybe they can get their bladder extended so they don't have to go to the toilet. Well, you don't know. I mean, that's the kind of, this is the kind of nonsense that we will get, as opposed to this idea that we're all going to be living for 2,000 years in some kind of paradise where the robots are serving us. It's not going to work like that, and one would have to be a fool to think that it's going to happen. So the once you set up the system with that apparatus, that propaganda model, that lack of courage, that coercion, the cowardice, that's the word that comes to mind in relation to the profession. It's gross, utter cowardice. We're all afraid of certain things. I'm not saying that there's not things I'm afraid of. Everyone is afraid of certain things. But again, in the Shakespearean, various versions of the Shakespearean statement that a brave man dies but once and a coward dies 1,000 times. And again, it goes back to the same source as the idea of transhumanism, fear of death, the fear. At what point is your freedom not worth it? If it's so small, what degree of freedom will you are you willing to survive for? You see the film Braveheart. They filmed, I don't know if you've ever seen the film Braveheart. I knew someone working on the set, so I went along to see the sets, and they filmed a fair bit of it in Ireland. And I was in Scotland. I was living in Scotland at that time, so I was interested in what they did. But remember when he's getting his balls cut off, and I think at the thing you say, oh, gee, well, I wouldn't fancy that. But I mean, there is a certain stage at which, when one gives up one's spiritual resources to compulsion, that the persistence in life with heart, with what courage means, becomes untenable. And the spiritual tradition has always, that's why we have the martyrs. I'm not encouraging people to be martyred, but that's why it was there, because they were willing to go through, be crucified upside down, have their head, in all the traditions, you can see that. And now they will make martyrs, or they will make victims of other people. Apart from the fact, another concern, a legal concern about this, the vaccination, is we know that during the Reagan era, they took away liability. Right. Now, they have no liability. Unfortunately, there's plenty of evidence of what happens when you remove liability. But even without that, if you look at the book that founded the consumer movement, Unsafe at Any Speed by Ralph Nader, that explained how the motor car executives made calculations that even when they knew they had a faulty model, that the money that they would have to pay out in damages would be less than the profit of the overall. So they said, okay, we'll live with that. So they knew that it would cause damage. Now that's when they knew there would be liability. Now they've taken away liability for these things, in relation to children and other contexts. And then when they say an emergency, they can do certain things in emergency. So how the scientists one day can say, well, these things require certain trials, and the next day they can say we abolish them, seems to me very, very unscientific. Do I trust it? No, I don't trust it at all. I know people that work in the pharmaceutical industry, and I know everyone has to earn a living, but people can be blind and sycophantic and turn a blind eye, and there's only so long you can do it. It's like they said in Nazi Germany, they come for one group one day, another group, and eventually there'll be nobody left. But there is associated with this machine misanthropy, an idea that has made people feel worthless and nihilistic, feel like they deserve to be taken over, they deserve to succumb to some greater force. They've been made so anxious. We're living in what I call a permanent cultural revolution. To take the idea of Trotsky and Mao's idea of a cultural revolution, and Trotsky's idea of permanent revolution. We're living in a permanent cultural revolution. The idea, you wake up, if you do read the newspapers, I try not to anymore, they depress me, and tomorrow there will be something that was strange today. What you believe today will be made strange tomorrow, and they'll do it the next day. And the purpose is to destabilize you, to confuse you, because confusion is a classic mode of hypnotic induction, and then you can get the message. You're going around, you're confused. In the end, when you get a clear answer, you will be delighted and you will jump on that. So make you confused, make you live in an anxious state, control your perception of the world, and then in the end, you'll say, okay, give me the answer. Oh, the answer is you take this. You know, it's only a little bit of graphene in your body, whatever it is. You know, so that's what's happening. And in this, there's a loss of will, there's a loss of courage, there's a loss of self-belief, and that's the domain of spirituality. And ultimately, if there's anything that's going to save us, it's not an intervention from beyond, it's us manifesting and exploring the full potential of our consciousness and applying it in creative ways. And I've said, to be positive about it, I've said I believe that there's a presence, there's a kind of formation of what I call a mystic murmuration, and murmuration, the way starlings move. There is what Eckhart Tolle talked about in a Christian context as a congregation of light, where mystics and spiritually evolved people will begin to meet each other and begin to communicate it won't be in any organized way. Any organization that happens will fail. And I can guarantee you that in the Irish context, every organization is taken over, every organization is subject to capture, the best organization, whatever it is. So by definition, there has to be a distributed meeting of minds, of spirits, of people that have across the world, across denominations, higher than the denomination, that are willing to look at what's happening, that are willing to pool their commitment to the human person, the individual person, to spirituality, their own spiritual evolution, to begin to look at solutions, to begin to persuade people about what's happening, to begin to first determine a robust analysis of what's happening, to identify the techniques, to identify the range of techniques that are used against the people, to identify solutions, to make changes in whatever way is possible, because it's individual first. It is all historical changes happens in the individual level when someone says, no, I'm not having that. And that's the most effective way. I've seen in the Irish context, sometimes when people are faced with military force, they have to respond in kind or they'll be destroyed. I understand that. But over the long term, it's not an effective strategy because other superior material forces can come into it. Without that change of heart and change of mind and change of spirit, nothing can be achieved. But the promise of a spiritual consciousness is that it's creative, that everything that we're talking about has come from this spirit, from consciousness. All the great things that we're talking about are products of it. So it is as if sometimes they are saying that, let's have eggs, we love eggs, but let's kill the chickens. You know, you can't do it. So human consciousness is strangely resilient. It has strange possibilities of accessing different levels of reality that it can employ at certain times. And it is often at the stage of a crisis where the prophetic, mystical, shamanic tradition asserts itself. And often then, when, if you want to call it the ordinary people, begin to say, okay, well, I have to take a stand. I would have rather getting on, having my burgers and looking at the sport or whatever, but no, you have to do that. And when those people do so, history, it changes the movement of history. That can only do when a person has an absolute certainty about something, not in a fundamental sense, but because the analysis is correct. And that's why I've tried to make an analysis which is based on historical statements, often what scientists have said, and utilize that long-term model, because you can't interpret in the short term what's happening when you see something happen. You can't tell in when a little segment why something has happened unless you look at the long trajectory. And you can understand these problems when you look at them in the historical trajectory. And it is no surprise that the humanities, the great irony, the people that are producing this post-humanism and the humanities disregard a lot of the great literature, and then they try and employ them. For example, there's an argument in the transhumanism literature that says, oh, well, Dante used the term trans uomo or whatever, and therefore he was in favor. It's just absurd. We really have to challenge. We can only challenge these things if we have a knowledge of them. So,
right. And I have to say that if I wasn't, if I didn't have the spiritual knowledge that I have, and just I can't say knowing, because I tend to think of it as just a belief, because it's kind of hard to know it. But if I didn't have that, regardless, I don't think I would have been able to, stand up the way I did. And I think that that's where a lot of people struggle, is they don't have there's no foundation on which to preserve your beliefs. No. Everything's just shifting sands, so I tend to think that the line in the Bible where Jesus says, if you set your foundation on sand, it's bound to collapse. Whereas you set it on a rock, it's good. I think that's very true. And I think you see that a lot in the world. And another thing that I think has prevented people from standing up or doing anything really is simply because it's convenient to go along with the agenda. It's convenient to you. You can, still get your paycheck. You can still go to the grocery store, even if you don't believe it. And I think that eventually, as you were saying, creates confusion. And then there's this cognitive dissonance that, I've experienced with my family, and I'm sure a lot of people have experienced it as well, where they'll agree that what's taking place is wrong. It's leading to something nefarious, yet they do nothing to, combat it. There's some sort of cognitive dissonance that takes place there. And I don't know that there's much that can be done, in my own opinion, which is why I try to find, these days, I'm more optimistic than I used to be when I first started really diving into this. And I attribute that a lot to spirituality too. And going back to the cycles, I think a lot of this is cyclical. Therefore, bad time may come, but it's not going to last. So I think we've covered a lot, and it's been a really, really fun conversation. And you can, answer or share your thoughts on what I just said too. But in wrapping up, is there anywhere else where people can find your work, maybe purchase your books, or just get to, dive deeper into, because you have a lot of work out there expressing your thoughts, and can support you buying your books.
Yeah, I do. I have to make a confession that I put my books on Amazon, and the reason why I did that was because publishers were not interested in a book about lockdowns, and people don't understand that the publishing system itself is part of the propaganda model. They don't realize that. They think there's a whole lot of independent. It's not. So people say, "Oh, don't buy it on Amazon." Well, listen, if you're not going to rely on the big companies, you have to live in a cave. We can't. You have to be pragmatic as well. So I'm just finished a book on transhumanism. So that will be out shortly. I will send a copy to you. And I have a website, www.jamestunney.com. I'm not on Facebook. There is another couple of James Tunneys, but so I do have the art and that there, and people can communicate if they want to. So I do concentrate on painting and writing, and one of the reasons why I do the painting is because it predicts for me what's going to happen. I can in my own psyche or whatever, some things in the paintings manifest there before they manifest in a cognitive way, which is interesting. So I find it very, very useful. But I sell art like other people do. But I agree with you about the cyclical thing, as you mentioned, but not in a deterministic way, as a way to understand the world, but not as a way to stop us changing the world. And you've indicated something as well about people making choices and convenience. The karmic idea, I believe to be true. I believe that we're living in a universe, and what all the great spiritual leaders were telling you is not to be good because of some place, not in some formulaic way. They were saying that we're living in that karmic universe, that what you do has consequences, what choices you make has consequences, and you have free will. And if you avoid those or take the wrong path, you will pay consequences for it. Now, you will pay sometimes in this life. If you believe in the afterlife, it has an impact. The choices, in my view, the choices that you make have an impact in your spiritual condition. And for me, in relation to what happens afterwards, there's a number of esoteric justifications or streams of that. But the quality of your spirit is important. It's important now, and it's important afterwards. But even in this planet, it will come back to haunt you. That's what they're the real ghosts. So you can only avoid so long. I understand it's very difficult for people. It's very, very difficult for people with families. But you have to believe that your consciousness is important, that your spirit is important, that your person is important. And we know enough about bullies and what happens with bullies. And this is the greatest historic bullying that has ever existed. And the nature of totalitarian systems is they will enlist everybody. That's what a totalitarian system is. You're the person who delivers to your door or whatever, or the person that provides other services, or the person in the supermarket, they will be enlisted in the totalitarian system. That is the nature of a totalitarian system. These have been predicted, and we are living in that empire of scientism. And the bad news is it can only get worse if it continues. So it can only get worse, and we're clearly talking about the end of the human race as we know it. It will become something else. And that's the motivation, the reason to realize that, and also to realize that people have been gulled, fooled, misled about the nature of spirituality, because the agenda cannot happen if people awaken, if that contact, that spiritual force is unleashed. In many ways, I didn't watch Star Wars too much, but that archetype is there. The archetype is there in that. I mean, Lucas looked to the Joseph Campbell and the perennial philosophy, and he drew on the same thing that goes out through history, whether you go back to the Catholic Church and Michael and Satan or Ahriman and so on. It's the same force. There is a force which denies that you're a spiritual, and a force which asserts it, and they're in constant battle. At the moment, the force that denies you're a spiritual being is winning, and it is going to be embedded in a material world, and it is going to assume people into the technosphere. So if that's not incentive enough for people to wake up, I don't know what is. But so I am optimistic. I'm not depressed or anything like that. Whether it's going to happen, it's a matter of free will, and that's where the choice comes in. So that's not determined either. We will see what happens. These are dark times in one sense, but the nature of spiritual life means that you should be able to cope better. You should be able to rely on your resources, your resilience. That's what those forces are, because they are transcendent. They transcend the mortal and the mundane, and they help us see the long term, because these other things are short-term manifestations of a darker force, and we have to take positions. There's no in between in this context. And media also has the other meaning of in the middle. It's in the middle of our masters and us. It creates an apparatus around us, a straitjacket. We have to be careful about that. We have to go back to the source. The source is in us. So I thank you, Luis. I enjoyed the conversation, appreciated the exploration, and I really enjoyed it. So thanks for the opportunity.
Of course, and thanks for coming on, and it's been a lot of fun, and you very beautifully ended it. I must say, very, very well. So thank you again.
Thank you again.